like say you lived in an area that was all, quite a bit of sand and gravel, and you got a lot of rain, and your screen was barely going dry, and the aquifer is fairly prolific. It could return fairly quickly, but in an area where there's a lot of clay and the well's a little deeper, it could take a really long time. I'm sorry I can't give more specifics without knowing all the information.
We've had more than 2 years of drought in the past 50, 60 years though, so don't you think that all these wells going out at once, there has to be more of an influence than just drought?
Oh yeah, like I said, I came today to give a talk on the geology and hydrogeology. I worked in the groundwater dispute resolution program, which is basically the law that people have been talking about to put back on the books from 2004 to 2009 when the law was rescinded. I gotta say that, there's been many times where I've seen areas of influence go out an extensive, long ways. I've seen droughts affect wells in different areas, like down in Monroe County. It's all very specific, and to be honest with you, no one in our department, or even right now, we don't have legislative authority to even tell people or to act on, tell people, this is a situation, this is what you need to do. There's no money set aside for us to look at these issues. So I guess from my perspective, if the question is if there's drought and there's a lot of irrigation, can irrigation wells affect water levels that can affect wells in the area? Sure.
What would you classify last year as far as being wet spring or dry spring last year?
I guess, I don't know I guess different parts of Michigan have different rainfalls and everything else. I guess I don't know what was going on in Tuscola County.
Last year, the farmers were a month late up here getting into the fields because it was so wet. And all this problem started last year. It didn't start this year. It started last year. It was a very, very wet spring last year.
Okay.
Extremely wet.
Dave, I'll address some of this. I'm on right now. Part of the reason for having Dave's presentation is to explain all of the influences that cause wells to go dry. It's not saying that irrigation hasn't caused the problem in your particular area or not, but the contributing factors that allow this many wells to fail. It's probably partly due to irrigation. It's also probably partly due to drought. Yes, last year was a good year for rain. There was no doubt about that. And we certainly didn't see the calls statewide that we have this year as a result of that. But with that said, this kind of lays a foundation, I think, for trying to go further into discussing potential parameters that we'll look at to see, what is causing various wells to go dry and try to come to some resolution. When you asked about the reach, how far out do you go to determine what the cone of influence is, it might be different if it's what Dave referred to as a confined aquifer and that deep well jet that might be affected is in that same aquifer. So there might be a larger influence there than if it was a shallow well jet that's up in a drift area, and it's probably going to be less likely that the bedrock well is going to affect that shallow well jet. So those are all the parameters that we have to look at, and we have to understand individual wells' characteristics before we can really see whether irrigation well or anything is influencing another system. So
do you know how big the aquifer is around here? According to that map that you showed the first slide.
In general, I can tell you, I believe it's the Millington area, they did some aquifer tests and really did a good job of looking at the geology there. Saginaw, typically down there, was about 100 feet thick. Michigan was around 60 feet, and then Marshall is a little over 100 feet thick.
Thickness.
depth.
Thickness. So drift would, I have to speak kind of in general because it's, like I said, with the way the map is, you're going to have different thicknesses and amounts based on where you are in the county. I hope that point got across, but in the Millington area, I can tell you that when they did the geology, when they did these type of aquifer tests I was talking about, because they do perform them like in Caro, Cass City, Gage Town, all these towns have performed aquifer tests because they need to know, hey, how much can this well produce? And they do these kind of tests. And when in Millington, when they were doing this type of work in that area, when they measured it, the Saginaw was essentially about 100 feet thick or about 100 feet below that drift material. That Michigan formation, that was a little bit more confining, more limestone, more shales, about 60 feet. And then the Saginaw, or I mean the Marshall below that was over 100 feet thick.
David, on that map though that we had, that was a glacial map. We've never really done with USGS a water study of the entire state with a thumb. Just so everybody understands, that's what we're working with right now. Is that is a glacial map and not a water study map.
Right. This. I hope I didn't confuse anybody by that, but this map, as well as the next one, was yes, that is a bedrock map, and then the next one was the drift map, which is basically the top layer, and then when you look at the next map, that top layer is glacial material. That's the silts, the clays, the gravels, but mostly that glacial material is clay. Now there are a certain percentage, less than 10% of the wells, that can actually get into that glacial material and get out enough water to get a well. But almost everything else, 90% of the wells, are in that material, the Saginaw, the Michigan, and the Marshall.
And we're going off of the glacial maps. I just wanted to make sure everybody's clear to that. We have not done a water study like you may think a water study should be done. And that's something that we've discussed with the USGS is looking at a cost. The only one of the three counties that I've known that have gotten into this a little bit is Huron County, and that was about 3 years ago. And the response from USGS was that you have a very unstable and very shallow opportunity for water, so you need to protect what you have for your water, your drinking water source, because it's not a sponge. So we do have discussions going on right now trying to find out what the cost would be with USGS to give you the tools. You don't have the tools you need to answer everybody's questions. It's not like we've done core samples all around the thumb and done pump tests to know exactly what everything is that we have to work with. So just so everybody understands, we're all on the same page. Our people from the state are going to give you as much as they can, but they have not been provided everything that they need to answer maybe some of the questions we have.
And as we get towards the end of the discussion, we'll also talk about possible studies to look into that more thoroughly. So,
could we go back to the pump slide, please?
the pump side.
The next,
the last one?
the last slide? Okay,
Sure.
okay. Now, with the discussion and the explanation that given different characteristics, high-capacity wells do have the ability of affecting other people's small-capacity wells. What requirements does the state and or local government place on testing what effect that high-capacity well is going to have before the user of that is allowed to punch it and already affect all the small-capacity wells? In other words, what are you doing to prevent the small capacity wells from going dry in the first place from the high capacity wells?
There is none. The program that we have in place right now for installation of new high quality or high quantity wells, excuse me, get a little mixed up, is the use of a water withdrawal assessment tool, and that tool looks at impacts to fisheries. It doesn't look at impacts to neighboring wells. So there is nothing in place.
And even when the groundwater dispute resolution law was in place, it's a reactive law. I mean, basically what you have is you have riparian rights and common law, and essentially if your neighbor's harming you, typically what you like to do is collect information talk to the person you think is harming you, but in the end, before the dispute resolution law was in place, and now, after it's been repealed, is essentially the court system.
When we issue permits for irrigation wells or large
Stand up
quantity wells,
and
When we issue permits for the large quantity withdrawal wells or the irrigation wells, they go through the groundwater assessment tool, which they were just talking about. Then they're also told that they have to register with Department of Environmental Quality for their withdrawal, and also Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Those are the steps right now.
But Tim, could you add, when they, we haven't explained this to everybody else, they think that when you register with the DEQ, there's an investigation or a process.
not unless they flag a zone C or D, and in the case of most bedrock wells, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I did work in the water withdrawal program for a little while. I've been in 4 programs in 8 years since I've been there, and all that water withdrawal assessment tool is looking at is when this well gets pumped, how is it affecting area creeks and streams and the characteristic fish population that's in it. That's what the water withdrawal assessment tool is doing.
So there's literally nothing in place right now that would tell somebody ahead of time what effect that high capacity well is going to have on the surrounding small capacity wells.
The only program and I was actually in this program as well, the Type 1 water supply systems, when we'd review their aquifer tests, and they were in an area where there was high density of homes, that would be something that we looked at. And we would make that recommendation to them. There may be issues, there may not be issues, but at this point, yeah, there really isn't.
And part of the issue up in this county, at least, is that some of these wells were put in, how many years ago, there's no records of them. So if there's no records, there's no way you can determine impact until the impact has essentially happened. And you have to also look at the conditions of the wells and all of those sorts of things. So, a well with submersible pump is going to, number one, also have a pump that's generally lower, but it's going to be in a better condition to work under pressure than, some of these jet pumps. So there's just not the ability to do that kind of study with, mostly because of the lack of data. So,
Maybe there's a question there.
yeah, you had a question.
Does the lower lake level affect the available water in these aquifers?
Certainly interconnection.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll be the first to admit I'm not the regional expert on interaction of lakes in Tuscola County with aquifer properties, but typically if the lake is fairly shallow, it's going to interact more with the drift material or that glacial material. And if you've got it would affect that system essentially first and be interconnected with that first if it's a real shallow well. Now, if you had a super, really deep lake that potentially went as deep as what some of these bedrock aquifers are, then there would be some type of hydraulic connection there too. You have a question?
We'll take one more question, and then we'll move on and take questions at the end.
How many monitoring wells would it take for you to know whether there's a problem in the area or not?
How many monitoring wells would it take for us to know that?
You define whether there's a problem in the area.
Well, I think the fact that everybody's here tonight tells us there's a problem.
Yes. That's my point. There was 40 monitoring wells, but now they can't be monitored because they don't have any water. That was last year. This year, we got over 60 monitoring wells and plant.
Where, now are these USGS monitoring wells, or what kind of monitoring wells are they?
No, I would say they're the best monitoring wells you can measure from the good.
Oh, the
water
residents.
here.
Yeah.
Well, when we get to the discussion of Saginaw County, we'll talk about what they've done when they had similar issues there, and that also dealt with placement of monitoring wells. So we're going to move on right now, but we'll take more questions at the end for Dave if you want. The next speaker is going to be Tim McGuire, and if you've been to previous presentations, I think folks from the health department have given updates of of the very issues have been, but for those people who haven't been to those meetings, I thought it would be useful to hear about some of the increases in the issue of well loss, water loss.
Since the first meeting, there's only been one additional permit that has been issued in the 4 townships that we've been talking about: Columbia, Elmwood, Ellington, and Elkland. Just background data that was given to you previously, but I'll say it again. Everything was looking at July, starting in 11. 31 well permits were issued in Tuscola County. In July 2012, 52 permits were issued in this county. In July 11, 8 permits were issued in the townships of Columbia, Elmwood, Ellington, Elkland. 2012, in July, 24 permits were issued in the 4 townships. A total in 2011 was 178 well permits issued. We've already issued 128 permits to this date in 2012. For July 2011, the wells drilled in the townships concerned equaled 26% of the total number of permits issued countywide. 2012, the wells drilled in the township of concern equaled 46% of the total number of permits issued countywide. From January 1st through July 31st, 99 permits were issued countywide. In January 1st through July 31st, 2012, 118 permits were issued countywide, resulting in a 16% increase. July 2011, 31 permits were issued in the townships of concern, the 4 that I mentioned earlier. And for July 2012, 52 permits were issued in the township of concerns, resulting in a 40% increase. We did issue one, like I stated earlier, this last month in that township, or one in the 4 townships that were concerned. So there definitely was an increase over the last couple of years. Most of the
But when we don't have tip those, where we went from 1 year from 8 to 24, it could have been 8 5-inch casing wells at a whatever depth.
Right.
24, we could have 10 to 18-inch 24 well. I mean, we don't know.
Correct.
And those could have been at a substantial depth and pumping a much larger GPM. So if we took the first year, let's say the 8 from 2011, if they were a 5-inch casing, and if we did a comparable study, even though we had a big increase from 8 to 24, we could take one of those 24 and that could equal 4. We could actually, basically, if we wanted to go apples to apples, maybe 8 to actually 100 wells in comparison to the previous year. So if we said 8 5-inch wells the previous year, just because we're going to 24, that doesn't mean those were all 5-inch wells.
Well, it also doesn't look at the age of the other wells. And
The
all
age
those.
of the wells.
I think the point here is that, yes, there have been increases.
We need more.
And the percentages have been in areas
Correct.
where there have been high-capacity wells pumping. So that's really, and what he didn't say is that there have been a lot of pumps lowered as well. So that's,
Right, and we don't
you know,
get
that-
no way of
and
knowing
we don't know those numbers either. But it was just to give you an idea that we understand and acknowledge that there has been an increase of the number of wells installed in the area. Yes.
Now, how many of those were new houses? Not very many, probably.
I'm sorry?
How many were new houses? I don't see very many going up
No.
around me.
No,
Slim
we did.
none.
None to none.
I'm trying to think of a new house in those 4 townships that I've been on the well and the septic, and
I haven't seen any.
not in the last couple of years.
No.
They're out replacing wells. Correct.
Most of the wells that have had problems have been the older wells, but that's not to say, I mean, you've had good wells up until that point, and that's important to acknowledge regardless. So we understand that there are problems
When you
with,
go without, what do you do?
what's that?
I said, when you have water, then there's 70 that go dry all in one day. What the hell do? You sit there, no water.
And
That's not right.
and that's what we're here for today, to try to figure out a solution so this doesn't happen in the future.
Have you ever rejected an application for a well?
Say that again?
Have you ever rejected an application for someone to drill a well?
Rejected an application to drill a well.
What
I don't think we've
would be
ever
the
denied one. I guess
authority to reject a well?
if you couldn't meet the proper isolation distances, you were too close to an area of contamination, On replacement wells, usually there's something that can be done depending on, we might require a certain type of grout, construction, different types of construction, might be steel casing. That's usually determining isolation issues with contamination sources. But I can't remember that we denied a well permit since I've been there in 19 years.
I have a question. I'm a water law attorney in the state, and there is a civil law they're called the law of reasonable use. Does that come into play at all as a part of your application and permitting process as to whether the quantities of water that's being drawn by these wells that are being approved do you have any jurisdiction